JD Vance was denied service at a coffee shop. What he did next shocked everyone. Imagine a place where people gather to have coffee, chat, and experience a bit of normality in turbulent times. Now imagine that place becoming a stage for political tension, hatred, and intolerance. That's exactly what happened when JD Vance, vice president and influential voice of the American populist wing, walked into a simple coffee shop and was greeted with coldness, contempt, and hostility. But instead of getting up and leaving, he asked for a coffee. This story, which seems to have come straight out of a political movie script, says much more than it seems. And that's precisely why we need to talk about it. What JD Vance did that morning was not just drink a coffee. It was an act of peaceful resistance. A gesture of someone who understands that, sometimes, the greatest strength lies in simply not reacting with anger. Faced with rejection, he didn't shout, he didn't debate, he didn't go on outraged live streams. He stayed silent. And in doing so, he exposed something much deeper than a political conflict: people's growing inability to listen to those who think differently. In my opinion, this kind of attitude is worth its weight in gold these days. We are so used to seeing politicians reacting with arrogance or victimhood when confronted, that the simple fact of someone sitting down and waiting for their coffee becomes a symbolic act. And in this case it was. Because it wasn't just about coffee, it was about belonging. About courage. About showing that he's not there to please the progressive elite or to run away from the fight. This episode made me think a lot about how we deal with disagreement. It's become fashionable to cancel, expel, block, shout louder. But what Vance did was the opposite. He stayed quiet, present, as if to say, you may not like me, but I'm still part of this. And that's precisely where the beauty and power of this gesture lies. If this kind of analysis makes you think, consider subscribing to the channel. Here, the conversation is direct, unfiltered, and always with a critical eye on what really matters. What strikes me most about this episode isn't even JD Vance's attitude, it's the coffee shop's reaction. A place that should symbolize welcome and plurality turns into a symbol of intolerance disguised as a political stance. And let's be honest, this has been happening all over the United States. The so-called progressive bubble, which claims to be open to dialogue, diversity, and inclusion, seems increasingly closed in on itself. As long as you think the same way, of course. Because all it takes is for someone to appear who deviates from the norm. Someone with traditional, conservative values or simply a different view of the world, for the environment to stop being inclusive and become hostile. In my opinion, this hypocrisy is becoming unsustainable. We can no longer ignore the fact that many of these progressive spaces function as zones of one-track thinking. They claim to be in favor of diversity, but reject anyone who thinks outside the bubble. And here comes a point that few have the courage to admit. This is a form of social censorship. An elegant, polite censorship full of pretty words, but censorship nonetheless. The case of the coffee shop in Columbus is symbolic because it exposes the left's fear of contradiction. They don't want to debate, they want to silence. They don't want to understand the other side, they want to erase it. And honestly, that says a lot more about the fragility of their ideas than it does about any supposed threat posed by figures like JD Vance. Meanwhile, real America, the America of families, workers, and ordinary people, is looking at all this and saying, enough is enough. If you also feel that there is something wrong with this progressive theater, this channel is for you. We say what many people think, but few have the courage to say. So, if you haven't subscribed yet, here's an invitation. Come with us. Another point that needs to be brought to the table, without fear, is this idea that boycotting someone for their beliefs has become something morally acceptable. Not only acceptable but even praiseworthy for certain groups. The coffee shop in Columbus tried to justify its attitude by saying that it is on the right side of history. And that is where the danger lies. This notion of the right side of history has been used as a shield to justify all kinds of cancellation, censorship, and exclusion. They think they are the owners of virtue. They think that because they are fighting fascism, any method is valid. But let's be real, what they are doing is pure ideological persecution. But with a pretty package. Do you know what's even more ironic? These people who advocate selective boycotts are always talking about empathy, love, and active listening, but they won't tolerate or have coffee with someone who thinks differently. As if the mere presence of a conservative were an existential threat. This is emotional fragility disguised as activism. I honestly don't believe in boycotts that stem from hatred. Boycotts cannot be used as a tool to silence others. When you start excluding people because of their political or religious beliefs, you've already stopped fighting for justice. You're fighting for control. You're imposing a kind of dictatorship of thought, where only one type of speech is acceptable. And that, historically, has never ended well. It's not about coffee. It's about freedom. About the right to exist in a public space without having to hide who you are or what you believe. And that goes for everyone, including conservatives, Christians, or right-wingers. Because if freedom doesn't work for everyone, it doesn't work for anyone. So, the question remains, what kind of society do we want to build? One where only one worldview is allowed? Or one where real plurality, and not just the one that pleases the intellectual elite, is respected? Now let's talk about one of the biggest accomplices in all this distortion, the traditional media. Where were the major newspapers, the progressive columnists, the opinion makers when this veiled persecution took place? Most of them simply remained silent. Or worse, they endorsed it with that disguised impartial analysis approach. It's curious how the media's outrage seems to have a side. When someone on the left is supposedly the victim of prejudice, the spotlight turns on. Scandalous headlines, experts give their opinions, celebrities speak out. But when it's a Christian, a conservative, someone who strays from the progressive playbook, the silence is deafening. And here comes my opinion. This is not journalism, it's selective activism. The press, which should be a pillar of freedom of expression, has often become a kind of ideological patrol. It decides what deserves to be debated and what can be swept under the rug. And in this case, since it was just an evangelical pastor, it wasn't worth the story. Even worse, when they decide to speak out, they do so with irony, trying to paint the situation as right-wing victimhood, as if there were no prejudice against Christians or conservatives. As if it were impossible for a right-wing person to be the victim of discrimination. But let's face it, intolerance is intolerance regardless of the target. The media should be defending principles, freedom of worship, respect for plurality, the right to opinion. But it has bowed to the pressure of digital bubbles, ideological activism, and the fear of being cancelled. This compromises not only the credibility of the press, but the very health of democracy. And when the media fails, the average citizen pays the price. The one who looks at all this and thinks, if even drinking coffee has become a political act, where can I simply exist? This question alone should be a warning. And you, what do you think about this? Have you ever felt this distortion in the news? This type of reflection needs to be done out loud. Because silence is also a choice, and, in this case, it is a dangerous choice. In the end, the episode of the vice president who was asked to leave for simply drinking coffee is not just about coffee. It is about a social climate where being Christian, conservative, or simply thinking differently can automatically make you a target. It is about an invisible ideological court that judges, condemns, and cancels, without the right to defense. We are experiencing a dangerous inversion. Those who preach tolerance are in practice intolerant of those who think outside the bubble. Those who shout for respect deny the other person's right to exist in peace. And that, honestly, says much more about them than it does about us. That is why this case cannot be ignored, ridiculed, or treated as an exaggeration. It exposes something bigger. Freedom of expression is being exchanged for ideological convenience, and this must be fought. Someone's faith cannot be a reason for exclusion. Having an opinion cannot be a crime. And drinking coffee cannot be an act of resistance. If we accept this kind of thing in silence, tomorrow it could happen to any of us. That's why, more than ever, it's time to speak up, to take a stand, to not be afraid of being cancelled. Because silence only fuels intolerance. If you've come this far, it's because this subject touches you in some way. So, like it, comment below what you think, and subscribe to the channel. It really helps bring this debate to more people who are also tired of so much hypocrisy. Here we say what we think, respectfully but without censorship. And if the world is trying to silence you, know that you're not alone.